Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are continuing on with the life of David. And today, what we're going to do, we are going to go directly from David and Goliath to this camaraderie that David has with none other but the son of Saul, King Saul, which is Jonathan. So, if you will turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18, we're going to look at verses 1 through 5, and then we're going to switch to 1 Samuel 20 and see how that friendship, and how that biblical camaraderie really just pans out and how that looks. This is a great example of biblical manhood, but also just biblical companionship and what a brother to a brother or a sister to a sister in Christ, what that should look like. And so let's deep dive into this, all right? So, chapter 18 in 1 Samuel, verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, would not let him. Saul took David, that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So we open up with this friendship with really a striking, um, just just kind of a striking example of humility from Jonathan. And here's kind of what's going on. So, the soul of Jonathan, and that really kind of shows you the spiritual connection that we have as believers in Christ to fellow believers. It is our soul, our very own soul, that is connected to our brothers and sisters in Christ. In the same way here, Jonathan's soul is connected with David's soul, not just because they are possibly around the same age or because they are both warriors, they have the same personality. That's not mentioned. I think it's because of the faith that they have in Jehovah God. And I think that is what connects them together. And it's interesting to see the humility of Jonathan. He makes this covenant, and this covenant will be more explained in chapter 20, so we'll get there in a second. But then in verse 4, he gives him a couple things. He gives him a robe, and then he gives him his military outfit. And there's a couple things that I want to note about this. First off, the robe is signaling that Jonathan believes and Jonathan knows that David is the one to take over for his father as king of Israel, not himself. Because again, as the son of Saul, he is the heir to the kingdom of Israel, and yet he gives that away. He gives that away and puts that on David. And not only that, but he gives him his military gear as well. So kind of what he's showing here is, look, David, I know that the Lord has made you the soon-to-be king, but he's also making you our soon-to-be protector as well. Now, obviously, the Lord is the protector, right? Yes, that is completely true. However, a part of a king's job is to protect. And so Jonathan is really basically showing that he knows for a fact that David is the one to take over the kingdom of Israel. And what a great moment of humility that is, right? So now we're going to put this to the test, though, because the rest of chapter 18 is Saul just really just kind of takes a a spiral. He really does. I mean, he kind of takes a spiral because he starts to get jealous of David because of the songs that people have sung that David is a much better warrior than Saul, which is true because David was the only one that stepped up and fought Goliath when Saul should have been the one to do that. And so the songs are completely true and honest, but Saul is not just jealous, but he's afraid of David. Look at verse 12 of chapter 18. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but departed from Saul. What a sad statement that is, but what also just a huge statement that is too. And so in chapter 19, this finally comes to this jealousy finally comes to a head, and he basically um, he basically tried to kill David. And so with that, David runs, and now David comes back to Jonathan, and he's trying to tell Jonathan, here's what's going on. What's going on? What's going to happen? And so let's look at that. 1 Samuel chapter 20, if you want to turn there with me. So first off, he starts in verse 1. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, what have I done? What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? Honest questions, right? And Jonathan said to him, far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. So he's kind of in denial, but he has a right to be in denial because he has no clue. He has no idea this is going on. And so David says, no, look, this is truly happening. Like, I'm not joking about this. This is actually happening. And so Jonathan says, okay, how do we test this? And so David says, look, I'm going to skip the next meal with you all. I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back to the city of Bethlehem, to my father's city. Or at least that's the plan. But basically, David wants to do this to see how Saul reacts. And so Jonathan says, okay, fine, let's try this out. Again, I don't think he really believes that his father wants to kill David, but he wants to find out. And so he puts this into plan. And then in verse 13, but should it this is Jonathan speaking, but should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant with the home of David, saying, may the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies. And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And that, again, just what an incredible moment this is. And biblical, godly camaraderie. He makes a covenant with David. And he says, look, if this is the case and you have to go away, then I am okay with that. I obviously would love for you to stay here, but if you have to go away for your safety, then go. But if that is the case, then promise me that when you become king, you will deal well with me and my family. Now, obviously, sadly, Jonathan does not make it to that point because he is actually killed in battle in 1 Samuel chapter 31 alongside his father. So he actually doesn't get to see David become the king that he knows he will be. And yet he knows that David will be king. And so he wants to show him, you know what, I believe in that. I do. So Jonathan comes up with this plan from in verses 18 through 23. He comes up with this plan that he will shoot these arrows, and then he'll tell the boy, go find them, and if they're beyond you, then then um, then that means that David has to leave. And so that is the plan. And now we'll see how Saul reacts. And so they come up with this meal, a family meal, and David should be at the table, being the kind of the general at this point, and yet he doesn't. And so Saul says, "What's happened to David?" And Jonathan tells him, "Oh, he wanted to go to Bethlehem," and so he just tells him that, and it's like, "Okay, let's see how my dad responds." Not well. And so, verse 30, then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." So basically, it's kind of like a curse. "Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore, send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." What a sad statement from the king of Israel, the one that the Lord had picked, and yet he is just so spiraled at this time. And you can tell here too that the only thing that Saul cares about is his power, is his kingdom. That's the only thing he cares about. He does not care about Israel per se. He does not care about David at all, obviously. He only cares about the power that he has and passing that on to Jonathan. And he realizes that Jonathan doesn't really care about that because he cares about David. And more so, obviously, he cares about what the Lord wants, which is David being on the throne. And so Jonathan obviously responds in a very obvious question. Jonathan answered Saul his father, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" In verse 32. And oh, this response from Saul is just heartbreaking. Verse 33, but Saul hurled his spear at Jonathan to strike him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had disgraced him. He will go to the very limit. Not only will he try to kill David, but he will even try to kill his own son to keep power within his grasp. Oh, what a decline for the king of Israel. And yet again, we know that this was the plan from the get-go, because in the beginning of 1 Samuel, we see that the people come to Samuel, the prophet, and say, we want a king, just like the other nations. And Samuel says, no, you already have one, the best one, and that is God. And yet they said, but that's not like the other nations. We want a human king. And so God says, look, give it to them. Give them what they want, and I will show them the difference between having a human king and the Lord as King of Kings. And because of that, it shouldn't be a surprise to us that Saul is just spiraling out of control. It's still heartbreaking to see, but it shouldn't be a surprise. And yet, it's just awful. And so Jonathan sees that Saul is nuts, but he also sees that he is going to kill David. And so he gets up the next morning and he takes possibly a servant boy and sends him out into the field, run and find the arrows that I shoot, in verse 36. And then he says to him in verse 37, is not the arrow beyond you? And Jonathan called after the boy again, hurry, be quick, do not stay. So Jonathan's boy gathered up the arrows and came to his master, but the boy knew nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And so the plan works. Jonathan is able to give David the warning, but now they have to say goodbye. In verse 41, and as soon as the boy had gone, David arose from beside the stone heap and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed one another and wept with one another, David weeping the most. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever. And he rose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. And this is obviously sad. This is a sad goodbye because, again, Jonathan does not live to see David become king because he passes away in chapter 31. It's just a sad, sad ending to this passage, but it's not the ending of the biblical um, friendship that Jonathan and David have, because again they've made this covenant, and when David becomes king after the death of Saul and Jonathan and the battle in 1 Samuel 31, one of his first acts early on a is to find a survivor of the house of Saul. And he does. And it's one of Jonathan's sons. And so he brings him into his own home, treats him like a brother or a son, and basically does his end of this covenant between these two men. And what a beautiful picture of biblical manhood this is, but just the camaraderie between a brother and a brother in Christ. This is what it should look like. Or a sister and sister in Christ. This is what it should look like. Being able to lean on each other no matter what you are going through. Yes, there are times where we need to stand alone with Christ and go through something on our own, trusting and depending in Him. But there are also times where we can lean on each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. We can lean on each other, and that's why the local church is so, so important. And that's why it's so important to become a member and a part of a local church like here at Brahman. And so that is the great lesson that we can learn from the friendship of David and Jonathan. So with that being said, we will continue on with the life of David as he makes another covenant, but this time between him and the Lord in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We're going to get to that next time. However, I will see you with Brad Word tomorrow as well. Thanks.